Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Eliana Kernodle. A package of bills that enshrine federal insurance mandates into Pennsylvania law passed the House of Representatives on Wednesday. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, tell us about these bills and what they do.
The bills that were passed, they just reaffirmed things that residents are already used to through their existing insurance coverage that became standard when Congress passed the Affordable Care Act, over a decade ago. The three bills tackle ensuring that adults up to 26 can stay on their parents' insurance, that there's no lifetime or yearly annual benefit maximums, and that there is no preexisting condition exclusions. So, like I said, these are things that insurance companies were already prevented from doing by the existing law. However, the State House here in Pennsylvania was concerned that if we don't do this now, if we don't act now on these certain provisions and make them a state requirement, that should Congress or the Supreme Court ever change their minds about those provisions, that coverage in Pennsylvania will not change.
And part of their reason for concern is just the number of cases that have been brought against the Affordable Care Act since it was passed.
Yes. So since 2010, there's been something like 2,000 legal challenges to the Affordable Care Act, and a lot of them have to do with the supposed constitutionality of them. There's been some recent lawsuits even within the last year. One of them was brought by a Texas business that said some of the coverages for preventative care, that is unconstitutional and shouldn't be allowed. That's being appealed to the higher courts right now. Then there's another pending lawsuit that's supported by 19 Republican state attorneys general that says undocumented migrants covered by the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, also known as DACA, that they shouldn't have access to the federal insurance marketplace. So these are just two examples of lawsuits that are still happening 14 years later. And it's exactly the kind of thing that makes lawmakers nervous at the state level. I think somewhat related to this conversation, although not having to do specifically with the Affordable Care Act, lawmakers in Pennsylvania are looking at what happened with the Roe v. Wade decision in 2022 when the Supreme Court decided to overturn that and send the decision back to the states. And in the last 2 years, we've seen many states move to either make abortion protections a constitutional right in their state or not. And so Pennsylvania hasn't moved one way or the other on that, although there's been a lot of controversy about amending our existing abortion laws. So lawmakers are really looking at it through that lens. They're like, well, if Congress could undo that or could change their mind on that, or if the Supreme Court could change their mind on that, then there's other things that they could feasibly change their minds on that would have a big impact on people in Pennsylvania.
So where in the legislative process are these bills?
So these bills just passed the House. The typical legislative process is they have to go through both chambers, and then once they are approved, they have to go to the governor for signature. So the House is really the first step in the process. However, all three of these bills passed with overwhelming bipartisan majority, which seems to signal that there's not a lot of resistance to them. I think there's a lot of argument here that the reason the House moved on them is because we are less than a month from an election, and protecting Affordable Care Act provisions is something that House Democrats, who are in control of the chamber and the legislative schedule, that's something that they would be able to tout on their campaign trails. So there's a little bit of politics as well as policy at play here. Now, Senate Republicans control the upper chamber. It's not clear how quickly they're going to act on this, and it's not clear how supportive they are. But again, given the wide bipartisan support in the House, one would think that it's not necessarily an issue for the Senate, although, one never knows in Pennsylvania. However, it's important to note that they only have a little over 6 weeks until the end of this legislative session, which is November 30th. And they're going to be out for several weeks in November because of the elections. So they really only have, I think, less than 10 days of legislative session left to get anything done. This is a time of year that we see a lot of horse trading for priorities. It's not clear if this Affordable Care Act protections are a part of that horse trading, so we'll just have to find out.
Well, Kristen, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.